The sun was low, casting its final, blood-red glow across the empty desert. The wind kicked up sand that cut like glass, and the mountains in the distance stood jagged, silent, as if they had witnessed too many tragedies to care about another. In the small town of Gray Butte, where the land met the sky in a barren embrace, there was always a quiet sense of waiting, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. And on this evening, with the storm clouds gathering over the horizon, it felt as though something was about to break. Eleanor Voss stood at the door of her small adobe house, her gaze distant, watching the sky shift from orange to an ominous purple. The wind tugged at her long, graying hair, but she hardly noticed. She had been a widow for over a decade now, and the lonely rhythms of life in the desert no longer unsettled her. Her husband, Thomas, had been a lawman, strong, steady, a man of justice, but the law had failed him, just as it had failed so many others. Shot in the back during a robbery, his body found in the dust, with no one to protect him. She had buried him, but she had not buried the bitterness. Her days were spent gathering herbs, brewing medicines, and offering what little care she could to those who still needed her. She was no healer, not in the way some of the more respected doctors in the town would claim, but she knew enough to make a salve, stitch a wound, and offer quiet comfort when it was needed. The town of Gray Butte had long since cast her aside, seeing her as a relic of a life they no longer cared to remember. But she had never been one to demand their attention. She had learned long ago that peace came in silence. The storm she had been expecting rolled in with a suddenness that startled even her. The wind howled, the sky split open with a crack of thunder, and the first raindrops fell, heavy and cold. Eleanor stepped back into her home, pulling the door shut with a creak. She took a breath, half relieved that the storm was here, half aware of the unease that always settled in her chest before one arrived. Then she heard it, a faint sound, too soft to be a cry, too faint to be human, but enough to catch her attention. Eleanor paused, her senses alert. It was a man's voice, strained, weak. She turned toward the window, peering out into the storm, her heart quickening as she squinted into the darkness. There, just beyond the ridge that led toward the canyon, she saw him, a lone figure on horseback, struggling, his movements unsteady, his horse stumbling under the weight of a rider who could barely remain in the saddle. She knew it was no mere traveler. There was something in the way the man moved, slow, deliberate, as though each step he took cost him dearly. Eleanor hesitated, the voice of caution whispering in the back of her mind. But the storm was worsening, and the man was clearly in trouble. She grabbed her coat, tied her boots tighter, and headed out into the downpour. By the time she reached the ridge, the man had fallen from his horse, his body crumpled in the mud, like a discarded doll. Eleanor knelt beside him, her hands steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. His clothes were soaked through, the dark stain of blood already mixing with the rainwater. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and she could see the faint glimmer of recognition in his eyes when they met hers. "Easy now," she murmured, reaching for his shoulders, trying to steady him. He grunted, barely conscious, but allowed her to pull him onto his back. His face was weathered, rough, and beneath the dirt and blood, she saw the remnants of a man who had once been strong, someone who had been through hell and lived to tell the tale. His eyes were a dull green, like the dying light of the evening, and she saw something flicker in them, something that reminded her of the wild men who came through the town. Outlaws. She had heard the rumors, the stories whispered among the townsfolk about the Crowder gang, a ruthless bunch who had been terrorizing nearby settlements. It wasn't hard to spot their mark, a crude tattoo of a crow on their arms. Eleanor's fingers brushed against his sleeve, and there, faint but visible under the mud, was the unmistakable ink of a crow. Her breath caught in her throat. She could leave him to die here, let the storm wash away any trace of him. But something inside her, something deeper than the fear of the gang's retribution, urged her to act. She had known loss, she had known violence, and she had learned to survive. And if she could save him, if he could be the one who could turn things around, she would give him that chance. She looked up at the sky, the storm raging, then back down at the man in her arms. "Hold on," she said softly, though she doubted he could hear her. She had no time to waste. With every ounce of strength she had, Eleanor lifted him into her arms and began to drag him toward the house. The wind whipped against her face, but she did not falter. In the space between breaths, she thought of her husband, of his unwavering belief in justice, of the way he had always protected the innocent, even when it meant his own life. She would not let this man die, even if it meant facing the very men who had taken everything from her. The rain had ceased by morning, leaving behind the sharp, earthy scent of wet soil and the sound of distant thunder that still rolled in the hills. Eleanor worked quickly, her hands deft as she cleaned the man's wounds. He was pale, barely stirring, his body betraying the toll of whatever violence had brought him to her doorstep. She had dressed his wounds, deep gunshot slashes across his ribs and a gash along his forehead, but the fever had already taken root, and his body shuddered with each labored breath. She moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, her mind never still. She had a long memory of men who rode in, their faces masked by their pasts, their hands stained with blood. She knew this man's kind. Outlaws, desperate, dangerous, running from something they couldn't outrun. And yet, as her gaze lingered on the cowboy's face, something in her chest tightened, as though there was more to this man than the ink on his skin or the blood on his hands. The door creaked open. Eleanor froze. Her pulse quickened, and she turned, eyes narrowing. A figure stood in the doorway, the silhouette of a man framed by the gray light outside. She didn't need to see him clearly to recognize Sheriff Holt's stance, cocky, confident, ready for trouble. "Mrs. Voss," he called, his voice too loud for the quiet that hung in the room. "Is it true?" Eleanor's hand tightened on the rag in her grip. She didn't reply immediately, instead finishing the task at hand. Sheriff Holt stepped inside, his boots scraping the wooden floorboards. His hat hung low over his brow, and his eyes flicked over to the injured man lying on the cot, his expression hardening as he took in the sight. "I heard tell you've been harboring one of the Crowder gang's boys, and here I thought better of you." Eleanor's voice was cool, controlled. "This man's no outlaw." Holt snorted, shaking his head. "No outlaw, huh? A man wearing the mark of the Crowder gang? You don't need to be a fool to see who he is." She faced him, refusing to back down. "And you don't need to be a fool to know the difference between a man who's running from something and the ones who chase him." The sheriff took a step closer, the weight of his uniform pressing down like an unspoken threat. "I don't care what you think, Mrs. Voss. That man, and the ones he runs with, are bad news. The law's been chasing them for months. And now you've gone and saved his life. He's not here because of kindness, I'll wager. He's here because he knows what you've been hiding." Her voice was low, but there was an edge of steel in it. "He didn't ask for my help. He didn't come here by choice." Holt eyed her, searching for something beneath the surface. He had known Eleanor Voss for years. Her quiet demeanor, her reluctance to mingle with the town's people, her sharp intelligence masked by a layer of grief. But even so, there were whispers in Grey Butte, whispers of her past, of her husband, and of her quiet, unforgiving nature. "You think this is just a coincidence, don't you?" Holt muttered, the edge in his voice turning colder. "That a man who belongs to the Crowder gang just happens to fall into your lap? No, ma'am. You've made a dangerous choice." Eleanor's hand gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into the rough wood. She didn't want to argue. She didn't want to explain herself to him. She had made her decision, and it wasn't for the sheriff to question. But she could feel the tension building in the air, thick and suffocating. "I'll do what I think is right," she said finally, turning away from him. "You can leave now, Sheriff." Holt stood silent for a moment, his gaze lingering on the cowboy, then back on Eleanor. "You might have made your choice, but you're not alone in this town, Mrs. Voss. And if that man is who I think he is, you'll find that the whole town's got a lot to say about it." He turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him with a force that rattled the window panes. Eleanor stood still for a long moment, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. She had lived in Grey Butte long enough to know how quickly rumors spread. She had seen it in the eyes of the townsfolk when her husband had died, how their gaze had shifted, as though they, too, had known he was doomed the moment he tried to stand for something in a town that cared for nothing but survival. She had seen how people would abandon what was right, what was just, in favor of the simplest, easiest path. But Eleanor was no longer that woman. She had buried Thomas, and in doing so, had buried a part of herself. But now she could feel the stirrings of something old, something fierce, something buried beneath years of grief. A part of her that would never turn away from a fight, even if the odds were stacked against her. Outside, the town had begun to stir. Word would have gotten out by now. Eleanor could already hear the murmurs, the whispers. Her name would be spoken in fearful tones. Her connection to the Crowder gang, her association with men like the one lying in her cot. They would never see her as more than a widow who had lost her way, a woman who had lost everything and now sought to protect what she could no longer control. But Eleanor knew better. She had seen men like these before, their hunger for power and money driving them to cruelty. And she knew that sometimes, just sometimes, a person could be more than the sum of their mistakes. As she leaned over the injured cowboy once again, the door creaked open. Eleanor's hand tensed, but the figure that stepped inside wasn't the sheriff. It was one of the town's few remaining doctors, Dr. Clayton, who had been Eleanor's quiet friend during the years of widowhood. His eyes softened when they met hers, and he said nothing, just moved to her side with a knowing look. "We need to keep him alive," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the storm that threatened to break. "But I fear there's more coming for him. And for me." Clayton nodded, his expression grim. "I'll help. But you're right. The town will turn on you, Eleanor. They always do." "I'm not worried about them," she said quietly, looking down at the man on the cot, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. "I'm worried about the ones who'll come looking for him." And Eleanor knew, with a certainty that settled like cold steel in her chest, that the real storm was just beginning. The days that followed were thick with tension, the kind that clung to the bones and made even the air feel heavy. Eleanor kept the injured cowboy Jace hidden away, tending to his wounds with careful hands, while the town's whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew the sheriff's warning was just the beginning. The Crowder gang was ruthless, and it wouldn't take long for them to notice one of their own missing. She didn't sleep much, moving quietly through the house at night, her thoughts consumed by the man lying unconscious in her spare room. She had been a part of this land for too long to believe in coincidences. The last thing she needed was trouble with men like Cole Crowder. She had lived through too much already. Each day brought new visitors, people from town who stopped by with small talk, but their eyes betrayed their suspicion. The rumor mill was in full swing, and Eleanor could feel the weight of their gaze. It wasn't just Sheriff Holt who was looking for Jace. Everyone in town had their own reasons for wanting him gone, but Eleanor wouldn't let them take him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the storm clouds that had lingered for days finally broke. The wind howled, and a new, ominous storm rolled in from the desert. A sharp chill cut through the air, the kind that set the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She had a sense, deep in her gut, that the storm wasn't just a change in the weather. It was a sign of something more. Jay stirred on the cot, his fevered brow damp with sweat. He muttered something in his sleep, words she couldn't make out. Eleanor went to him, kneeling by his side. Her fingers brushed against his face, a gesture of comfort more for herself than him. His green eyes flickered open, unfocused, but there was recognition there. "Eleanor," he rasped, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. She leaned closer, her gaze steady. "You're safe. For now." Jace's lips twisted into a faint smile, but the smile was tinged with bitterness. "For now. You don't know what kind of trouble you've gotten yourself into." Eleanor didn't flinch at his words. She had heard them before, and she knew the truth of them. The trouble wasn't coming just from the outlaw world. It was coming from the town, too. They'd turn on her, just like they had turned on her husband. The law had always been too quick to abandon anyone who wasn't of use to them. "I can handle trouble," she said, her voice firm. "What I can't handle is knowing I could have done something and chose not to." Jace looked at her with a strange intensity, as if weighing her words, and then his gaze flicked to the window. He didn't say anything for a long time, but Eleanor could see the wheels turning in his mind. She had no illusions about who he was. She didn't need to. The mark of the Crowder gang on his arm told her everything. She looked out the window herself, eyes scanning the barren landscape. A pair of dust-streaked riders appeared on the horizon, moving at a steady pace. They were too far to identify, but Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Her instinct screamed at her that they weren't here for good reason. She moved quickly, making sure Jace was settled in the corner of the room, hidden from view. She grabbed the rifle her husband had left behind, the one she'd sworn never to touch again. It felt cold in her hands, the weight of it somehow unfamiliar. But she knew it had to be done. No one would come to her aid. She had learned that long ago. Just as she was about to leave, a knock came at the door. Eleanor's grip tightened on the rifle, her body going tense. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Not now. "Mrs. Voss," came the voice, and Eleanor's heart sank. "Sheriff Holt." She didn't answer immediately, but the knock came again, this time harder, louder. "Mrs. Voss, open up. I need to speak with you." She didn't move, just stood there, listening. She could feel the weight of his presence on the other side of the door, feel the way he waited for her response. This was it. The moment had come. Slowly, she made her way to the door, rifle at her side, the tension thick in her chest. She opened it just enough to see him standing there, his hand resting on his holster. "I'm afraid you're harboring a fugitive," Holt said, his voice as cold as the wind howling behind him. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She took in the sheriff's appearance, his hat pulled low, his eyes hard and unyielding. There was no mercy in them. "I told you I wasn't hiding anyone," she said quietly, but there was a steel to her voice now, something that had been missing before. She wasn't the same woman who had stood by and watched her husband die without lifting a finger. She was someone different now. Holt's lips curled into a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Funny thing about the truth, Mrs. Voss. It's a stubborn thing. I reckon we're going to find out just how stubborn yours is real soon." With a sharp motion, he stepped back and signaled. Eleanor heard the low rumble of hooves in the distance, and her blood went cold. More riders were coming. More than just Holt. The rest of the gang, probably. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," she said, her voice low and steady. Holt's eyes flicked to the house behind her, a flicker of suspicion in them. "I don't think I am." He turned and walked away, his boots kicking up dust with each step. But Eleanor didn't follow him with her eyes. She could feel them, more riders, closing in. She turned, moving quickly through the cabin. She could hear the distant sound of horses, the galloping rhythm, like thunder rolling through the plains. It wasn't long before they would be on her doorstep, and there was no time left to waste. She looked at Jace, his face pale, but his eyes clear. There was no more pretending. There was no more hiding. "I'm going to hold them off as long as I can," she said to him, her voice firm. "You stay out of sight. Don't make a sound." Jace nodded, understanding. He didn't need to be told twice. He was a fighter, despite his injuries, and he knew the game they were playing now. Eleanor went to the window, her heart pounding as she saw the riders getting closer, dust swirling in the fading light. Sheriff Holt had already signaled his hand, but Eleanor wouldn't let them have what they wanted. Not without a fight. As the riders drew nearer, Eleanor's breath slowed, her grip tightening on the rifle. It was time to finish this. And this time, she wouldn't back down. The riders came like a storm on horseback, their silhouettes dark against the dying light of the day. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the rifle, the stock cold against her palm, her breath steady, but her heart racing. She had expected this. She had known it was coming, but nothing could fully prepare her for the sight of men like these, hardened by lawlessness and driven by the weight of greed. The wind picked up, swirling dust through the air, and for a moment, the world felt still, as if everything was waiting. The riders were less than 100 yards away now, their horses kicking up the earth with each powerful stride. Eleanor could see Sheriff Holt at the front of the group, his face grim, his eyes narrowed with purpose. He was no longer just a man in uniform. He was an instrument of justice, or at least, the law he swore to uphold. Eleanor stood at the window, her mind working fast, calculating. The cabin was small, and there was nowhere to hide. Not from the man outside, not from the truth of her situation. The weight of what she had done, of what she was about to do, pressed on her like the weight of a mountain. Jace was behind her in the shadows, his breathing still ragged but steady. He didn't speak, didn't move. He was waiting, just as she was, for the inevitable. Eleanor could hear the riders approach now, the creak of leather saddles, the low mutter of their voices carried by the wind. She turned to him, her eyes catching his for the first time in days. His face was drawn, haggard from fever, but there was a determination there too, an understanding between them that hadn't been spoken aloud. He didn't need to ask what she was planning. "You don't have to do this," Jay said quietly, his voice a rough whisper. "You've already done enough." Eleanor shook her head, a hard line forming on her lips. "I've done nothing," she said, the words biting with truth. "Not until now." She moved toward the door, her steps sure and deliberate. Jace's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes were intense, desperate. "Eleanor, you don't have to fight them. You've already done more than anyone could ask." She looked down at his hand, the touch soft but firm, and for a moment, she considered his words. She could just close the door, hide away with him, let the town burn itself out. But she knew the cost of such a choice. It would be the same cost she had paid when her husband had died in that empty grave, when she had done nothing but watch. "I don't know how to let things go, Jace," she said, her voice quieter now, but laced with an unshakable resolve. "Not when I've already buried so much." He looked at her, and in that moment, she saw the ghost of someone else in his eyes, someone who had fought for what they believed in, even when the world had turned its back on them. He released her wrist slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the table as he settled back into the shadows. "Then I'll stand with you," Jace said, his voice low, but the words carried weight. "But don't make this a fight you can't win." Eleanor didn't reply. She didn't need to. The fight had already begun. She stepped outside into the cold evening, her boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. The riders had stopped at the far end of the yard, their horses restless beneath them. Sheriff Holt was in the lead, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. He was too far away for an immediate confrontation, but he wouldn't be for long. The other riders flanked him, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their postures tense and ready. These men weren't here to talk. Eleanor stood tall, rifle in hand, her shoulders squared against the wind, the chill biting at her skin. She could feel the weight of their gaze, of the sheriff's scrutiny, but she didn't flinch. "Not this time." "You've made a mistake, Mrs. Voss," Holt called out, his voice carrying over the silence. "The law doesn't take kindly to those who shelter criminals." Eleanor didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him, the way his coat flapped in the wind, the way his eyes darted to the door behind her, as if expecting something to emerge. She knew what he was looking for. He wanted confirmation, a reason to justify his actions. "I've made no mistake, Sheriff," she said finally, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "But you've made one, and you're going to regret it." Holt's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might draw his gun right then, the tension between them thick enough to slice with a knife. But instead, he motioned for the others to stay back, and they did, their horses shifting uneasily. "Step aside, Mrs. Voss," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Eleanor didn't budge. She stood her ground, the rifle steady in her hands. The wind tugged at her hair, her coat fluttering like the flag of a battle she was determined to fight. "You don't understand, Holt. This isn't about you or me. It's about what's right." Holt didn't respond. Instead, he reached for his gun, a slow, deliberate motion. His hand hovered over the holster, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor didn't waver. She had made her choice. The first shot rang out before she had time to think, a sharp crack that shattered the stillness. Eleanor's heart raced, but she didn't move. The bullet hit the ground at her feet, the dust rising in a small puff. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Then she raised the rifle to her shoulder, her aim true. The second shot was hers. The bullet flew, cutting through the air with deadly precision. It struck the rider closest to Holt, sending him tumbling from his horse. The gang members froze, their hands twitching toward their weapons, but they didn't make a move. The silence that followed was deafening. Holt's eyes were wide with surprise, his hand still hovering over his gun. But then his expression shifted, something cold and dangerous flickering in his eyes. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to someone standing against him. "You're a fool, Eleanor," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "But you won't win. Not this time." Eleanor didn't respond, her eyes locked on him, her stance unwavering. She wasn't here to win. She was here to stand, and for once, that was enough. The wind howled, the storm still raging on the horizon, and in that moment, Eleanor Voss knew that no matter what came next, the truth had already been carved in the dust.